Imagine you're sitting in a dimly lit studio in the 1860s. You've just paid an exorbitant amount of money, about a month's wages, to sit before a massive wooden camera. You hold perfectly still. The flash blinds you. But when the photographer hands you the final image, you aren't alone. Standing right behind you, their hand resting gently on your shoulder, is a loved one you buried years ago. This was the promise of William H. Mumler. Often remembered today as a rogue scientist of the occult, Mumler was actually a Boston jewelry engraver and an amateur chemist. But in the mid-19th century, he did something that shocked the world. He claimed that his camera could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. This is the story of the first spirit photographer, and how he used the cutting-edge science of his day to hack the human heart.
To understand how Mumler became a sensation, you have to understand the world he lived in. In the 1860s, America was drowning in grief. The Civil War was claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Disease was rampant. Almost everyone had lost someone: a son, a husband, a child, often far from home, with no chance to say goodbye. At the exact same time, a new religious movement called spiritualism was sweeping the nation. Spiritualists believed that the dead weren't gone. They were just on a different frequency, and they could be communicated with. People were desperate for a sign. And then, along came photography. To the average person in 1861, photography itself already felt like magic. You mix silver nitrate, collodion, and iron sulfate, expose it to light, and suddenly time is frozen on a piece of glass. If science could capture the invisible properties of light, why couldn't it capture the soul? Mumler didn't invent this desire, but he was the first to successfully commercialize it.
The story goes that in 1861, Mumler was experimenting with a camera when he took a self-portrait. When he developed the plate, he saw the faint apparition of his deceased cousin sitting in the chair next to him. Word spread. Soon, Mumler quit engraving and opened a dedicated spirit photography studio. He operated with the flair of a clinician. He allowed skeptics and other photographers to inspect his studio, his camera, and his chemical baths. They found no hidden mirrors, no trapdoors, no trick lenses. To many, this was empirical proof. The camera, an unfeeling mechanical observer, could not lie. His most famous photograph, and one of the most famous images of the 19th century, came from a grieving widow who visited his studio under a fake name. That widow was Mary Todd Lincoln, and the ghostly figure standing behind her, resting his hands affectionately on her shoulders, was the assassinated president, Abraham Lincoln.
But science requires replication, and eventually the scientific method caught up with William Mumler. By 1869, people started noticing something disturbing. Some of the spirits in Mumler's photos looked suspiciously like people who were still alive, specifically people who had recently sat for normal portraits in Mumler's studio. He was brought up on charges of fraud in New York. The trial was a media circus. The prosecution even brought in P.T. Barnum, the famous showman and hoaxer, to testify against Mumler, essentially arguing, "I know a con artist when I see one."
So, how did he do it? Mumler was exploiting a technique called double exposure. Before the client ever arrived, Mumler would take a photograph of an existing portrait, or have an assistant dress in white and stand in the frame for just a second. He would underexpose this image on a glass plate. Later, when the paying client sat for their photo, Mumler would use that same glass plate. The new, longer exposure of the living person would dominate the image, while the old, short exposure would show up as a faint, translucent ghost. Because Mumler was a master engraver and chemist, his darkroom sleight of hand was flawless. He swapped the plates right under people's noses. Surprisingly, Mumler was acquitted. The prosecution couldn't prove exactly how he faked specific photos, only that it was possible to do so. But his reputation was ruined, and he died in poverty in 1884. William Mumler wasn't a scientist trying to map the afterlife. He was an opportunist. But the legacy of his photographs is surprisingly complicated. Look at the faces of the living in these photos. The relief, the comfort. For a brief moment, the science of chemistry gave these people exactly what they needed, the illusion that they were not alone. Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper into the strange intersections of science and the supernatural, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.